The Vienna talks of the weekend, an Iranian official said America is serious about returning to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and has announced its readiness to list some of the sanctions that have been placed on Iran. An Iranian foreign minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif, tweeted Saturday, quote, "Today POTUS has to decide whether U.S. continues lawlessness or adheres to the law. Onus is on the U.S., not Iran."
So, professor at Georgetown University, author, executive vice president at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, Dr. Trita Parsi joins us now to talk about this and more. So, Dr. Parsi, update us on the talks that we currently see. Big piece in the New York Times this morning about how the U.S. and Iran have been meeting, but they deeply, quote, disagree on what that means to restore the nuclear deal. Do you agree with that analysis? What do you think is happening here?
I'm not really sure I do agree with that analysis. I think that analysis kind of mixes two different things, whether the two sides are in agreement and have a shared interest in getting back into the JCPOA, and also if they are in agreement on what happens afterwards. When it comes to what happens afterwards, there are, at this point, going to be disagreements. So, for instance, the piece focuses on the fact that the U.S. wants to make sure that we quickly start renegotiating certain aspects of the deal and start addressing missiles and other issues. And the Iranians, apparently, according to this article, is saying flat out no. I think what is happening is that the Iranians are saying they're not going to talk about anything else until the U.S. has rejoined the deal. And then once the U.S. has rejoined the deal and there is a different administration in Iran because they're having their elections in roughly 4 weeks or so, that's when we can really investigate whether the Iranians are open or not to such negotiations. But to judge that right now, I find somewhat misguided, because we're in a situation in which the U.S. is still not even back into the deal, and the Iranians are being quite clear. They're not going to entertain expanding the agenda until the U.S. first lives up to its obligations under the deal.
And so is the U.S. planning to re-enter the deal? And are you worried about the results of the elections in 4 weeks and how that may impact these negotiations?
At this point, I think it's quite clear, based on how they're negotiating, the two sides are definitely serious. I think they have managed to overcome some of the toughest issues. Some issues obviously remain. It's part of the negotiations. It's a tricky negotiations because they're actually not talking to each other directly. They're talking to each other through the Europeans. But there are some natural deadlines we talked about a lot on the show. I think one that is coming up is roughly in just a week or so, when the Iranian Guardian Council, a highly undemocratic element of the Iranian political system, is going to come out and determine who will be allowed to run for president or not. At that point, those declared and approved presidential candidates are likely going to start sniping not only at the JCPOA, but also at the ongoing negotiations, which will further reduce the maneuverability of the Iranian negotiators. So I think it lies in the interest of both sides to try to wrap this up before we reach that point, because after that, the Iranian election season begins in earnest.
Right. And so then what are the pressures inside the Biden administration right now? I mean, is there a wholesale agreement that getting back in the deal first is the most important thing? Or are there different structures and are there different fissures in their negotiating patterns?
I think it's quite clear that the president has made a decision. He wants to get back in. But what I think the U.S. side really wants to get some form of a sense, if not a guarantee from the Iranians, is that there will be a renegotiation afterwards. Some of these issues are understandable, I think. In 2023, the United States is scheduled to lift sanctions in Congress in return for the Iranians ratifying the additional protocol. It's a very important document that allows much stricter inspections into the Iranian government, into the Iranian nuclear program. The Iranians are currently voluntarily implementing that, but in 2023, they have to ratify it in their parliament, and the U.S. needs to actually undo sanctions, not just talking about using waivers, but actually lifting the sanctions legislation in Congress. That's going to require a massive amount of political capital, and is happening just 1 year before the U.S. presidential election. So I think it's quite understandable that from the U.S. side, one would like to push forward some of these deadlines a little bit further, mindful of the fact that 4 years have been lost. But again, it seems like the Iranians are not willing to renegotiate anything until the U.S. first is back into the deal.
Yeah. Finally, Dr. Parsi, on a different issue, you've been tracking how the Biden administration's intent to withdraw from Afghanistan is already starting to reshape some of the politics in the Middle East. Just talk a little bit about that for us.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting. There's a common view in Washington that if the United States were not in the Middle East militarily, the whole region would just descend into chaos. And the only thing that is really standing between utter chaos in the Middle East and not is the U.S.'s military presence. We are now increasingly seeing evidence that the contrary may actually be true, because with the Biden administration fulfilling or at least continuing on the path of the Trump administration and withdrawing Afghanistan, sending clear messages to the Saudis and others that, it's not the same game as before. The U.S. is shifting its focus away. That has actually generated and prompted regional actors to start engaging in their own diplomacy. There's been at least 5 meetings between the Iranians and the Saudis in Iraq since January, in which they're trying to resolve their tensions over Yemen, but also broader issues in the region. Those conversations have also included the UAE, the Jordanians, Egyptians. It's exactly the type of regional dialogue we should be seeing. And here's the interesting thing. The U.S. had nothing to do with it. The U.S. was not pushing them to do this. This was an initiative by the Iraqis themselves, because the Iraqis are the ones that will pay the price if the Saudis and the Iranians continue with their tensions. And they're stepping up to resolve these tensions and shoulder security and responsibility for the region themselves, which is exactly what we want, which is exactly what we're getting as we are starting to leave the region militarily.
That makes sense.
Such an important note. Dr. Parsi, great to see you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much for having me.
Our pleasure. We'll have more Rising for you after this.